Hey my friends, tonight we journey back to a time when your choice of footwear could land you in some seriously hot water, or at least leave your purse considerably lighter. Picture this, you're strolling down a bustling medieval street, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread in the air. Perhaps a whiff of something less pleasant too. It's the Middle Ages after all. You're feeling pretty pleased with yourself. Maybe you've just treated yourself to a new pair of shoes, a rather fetching shade of, say, bright blue. Suddenly a stern-looking fellow with an official-looking badge and an even more official-looking frown stops you. He's not admiring your fashion sense. He's about to hit you with a fine that could feed your family for a week, all because of the color of your shoes. Honestly, with the plague famines and generally abysmal sanitation, navigating the fashion police was just one more way you probably won't survive this. It's a wonder anyone dared to get dressed in the morning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I love to see where you're all tuning in from. So drop your location and local time in the comments below. It makes our little history community feel that much cozy. Now let's dim the lights. Let the soft hum of a fan fill the quiet and gently step into tonight's story, just you and me. You're walking through the cobbled laneway, the rough stones uneven under your feet, and you can't help but feel a little proud of your new acquisition. They aren't the ridiculously long, pointy shoes some of the nobles are sporting. Those things look like a tripping hazard invented by someone who secretly hated their friends. But they are a vibrant, cheerful color. A deep, rich crimson perhaps, or maybe that bold blue we just imagined. You saved for these. You pictured how they'd look, how they'd make you feel just a little bit more you. The dye alone cost a pretty penny, a testament to its quality, or so the merchant assured you, with a wink and a nudge. But as you pass the market square, a shadow falls over you. Not literally the sun is still high, but a metaphorical one. A man dressed in sober dark wool, nothing flashy about him, oh no, detaches himself from a doorway. He carries no sword, but he has a certain air, an officiousness that makes your stomach do a little flip. He's one of them. The wardrobe watches, the fashion, enforces the men, tasked with ensuring that you and everyone else dressed according to your station. And his eyes, my friend, are fixed squarely on your feet. A moment, good sir, or good madam. He might say, his voice devoid of warmth. He gestures towards your shoes. Those are rather brightly colored for one of your standing, are they not? And just like that, your day, your pride, your carefully saved coins are all under threat. Because in medieval Europe, what you wore wasn't just a matter of personal taste or how deep your pockets were. It was a matter of law. These were the sumptuary laws, a complex, often bewildering, and endlessly fascinating set of rules designed to regulate what people could wear, eat, and even how they could furnish their homes. The very idea of fashion police isn't some modern joke. It was a lived reality for centuries. And while we might fret about a fashion faux pas today, back then, the wrong outfit, the wrong fabric, or indeed the wrong color shoes could lead to very real, very unwelcome consequences. Forget a snide comment on social media. You were looking at fines, public shaming, or even confiscation of the offending garment. Talk about a soul-destroying experience. The core idea was that your clothing should immediately signal your place in the rigid social hierarchy. A peasant shouldn't look like a merchant. A merchant shouldn't look like a knight. and heaven forbid anyone look like a high-ranking noble or, dare we say, royalty. It was about maintaining order, a visual representation of the great chain of being, where everyone knew their place and crucially stayed in it. So those bright blue shoes. If you were, say, a baker's apprentice, that color might be deemed far too ostentatious, too indicative of a status you hadn't earned and weren't entitled to. The fines themselves could be crippling. We're not talking about the equivalent of a parking ticket. For some offenses, the fine could be more than a skilled craftsman earned in several months. Imagine saving up for a new cloak only to have it confiscated and be fined double its value because the fur trim was deemed too luxurious for your social stratum. It's a bit like getting a speeding ticket for owning a car that merely looks too fast for your income bracket. Now the enforcement of these laws was, shall we say, inconsistent. It varied wildly by region, by decade, and even by the zeal of the local officials. Some places were notoriously strict, while in others a blind eye might be turned, especially if you knew the right people or could offer a discreet sweetener to the enforcer. One of the mainstream historical facts we know is that sumptuary laws were incredibly widespread, appearing in ancient Greece and Rome, and then flourishing with a particular vengeance across medieval and Renaissance Europe, from England and France to Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. They weren't a quirky, isolated phenomenon. They were a common tool of governance. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind these detailed footwear regulations and sumptuary laws in general was purely about social stratification. Was it all about keeping the lower orders in their place, visually reinforcing the power structures, or were there significant economic drivers like protecting local textile industries from foreign imports by restricting who could wear expensive foreign silks or brocades? Or perhaps it was a moral panic, a belief that excessive spending on flashy clothes was leading to societal decay and a decline in piety. The truth, as it often is probably a messy combination of all three, and it wasn't just color. The material of your shoes mattered immensely. Certain leathers were off limits. Maybe your crimson shoes were made from cordwain, a fine goatskin leather from Cordoba in Spain. If that was restricted to the gentry in your region, you were doubly in trouble. The style too, as we'll explore later, could be a major issue. Those long pointy toes we mentioned, called krakoves or poulains, became so extreme that laws were passed to limit their length based on your social rank. Imagine a nobleman being allowed, say, a 2-foot point, while a mere merchant might be restricted to a demure 6 inches. It sounds comical now, but it was serious business. There's a quirky tidbit for you. In England, under King Edward IV, it was actually decreed that anyone below the rank of a lord was forbidden from wearing shoes with points longer than 2 inches. Try playing football in those. Or, well, whatever the medieval equivalent was. Probably involved fewer rules and more broken bones. So as you stand there under the gaze of the wardrobe watcher, your heart sinks. Your beautiful new shoes, the ones that made you feel so good, are suddenly a source of acute anxiety. He's probably already calculating the fine in his head. And you're calculating how many loaves of bread, how many tankards of ale that fine represents. The dream of stepping out in style has turned into a potential financial nightmare. It makes you wonder if sticking to drab, sensible, legally approved brown wouldn't have been the wiser if done a choice. After all, who needed the stress? But then again, where's the fun in that? Even in the Middle Ages, the desire to express oneself, to wear something beautiful, was a powerful human instinct, laws or no laws. So there you are, heart thumping like a drum solo at a royal feast, your beautiful, illicitly colored shoes suddenly feeling like lead weights. The wardrobe watcher, bless his cotton socks, or more likely his legally mandated rough wool ones, clears his throat. He's not just being difficult for the sake of it. He's upholding the very fabric, quite literally, of society. He might even deign to explain in that condescending tone officials have perfected throughout history that your footwear violates Article 7, subsection B of the latest proclamation concerning apparel and the maintenance of due order. Or you know something equally catchy. These proclamations, these rules that dictated who could wear what when and how are what we call sumptuary laws. The name itself sounds rather grand, doesn't it? It comes from the Latin word sumptus, meaning expense. So these were at their core laws, about expenditure laws, about consumption. And boy, did they consume a lot of official parchment and parliamentary debate time. You'd think with all the wars and plagues they'd have bigger fish to fry, but apparently preventing a farmer's wife from wearing a silk ribbon was right up there on the to-do list. It was all about keeping up appearances, or rather keeping down the appearances of those who weren't born into the velvet-clad upper echelons. Now you might think these laws were solely focused on your wardrobe choices, a kind of medieval what not to wear, enforced with financial penalties instead of just snarky comments from Trini and Susanna. But oh no, my friend, their reach was far more ambitious, far more intrusive. Sumptuary laws aim to regulate almost every aspect of personal expenditure that could visibly signal wealth or status. We're talking about the number of courses you could serve at a dinner party. Imagine a medieval potluck where Brenda from accounts gets fined because she brought 7 types of cheese when the law for her social standing clearly states a maximum of 3 dairy items, and one of them better be a very humble cheddar. They dictated the extravagance of weddings, how many guests, the value of gifts, even the richness of the bride's dowry. Funerals too were a target. Grieving families in their desire to honor the deceased and perhaps show off a little to the neighbors might spend ruinously on elaborate processions, expensive mourning clothes, and lavish feasts for the mourners. The authorities, ever watchful, stepped in to limit such displays, partly to prevent families from bankrupting themselves, but also, one suspects, to ensure that no one's grief looked more impressive than the king's when his favorite hunting dog passed away. Even the furnishings in your home could fall under that purview. How many silver spoons you owned, whether you could have tapestries on your walls, or if your bed curtains were made of imported damask. All this could be subject to legal limits based on your rank. It's like having an interior design police force. Excuse me, madam, is that a third cushion on your window seat? The law clearly states commoners are permitted only 2, and one must be stuffed with straw, not these fancy goose feathers. It's a wonder people didn't just live in empty rooms eating gruel to avoid the paperwork. But clothing was their bread and butter, the most visible and immediate way to enforce social distinctions. And the details they went into were astonishing. We've talked about color, and that was huge. Certain dyes were incredibly expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Tyrian purple, famously extracted from sea snails, was so costly that it was almost exclusively reserved for royalty. or the highest echelons of the church. Wearing purple if you weren't on that very short list wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was practically treason. Other colors like scarlet from the kermes insect or certain vibrant blues from woad or later indigo were also strictly controlled. So your choice of shoe color wasn't arbitrary. It was a direct reflection of the cost and rarity of the dye, and thus your perceived wealth and status. Then there was the fabric itself. A mainstream historical fact is that silk, often imported from the East or later from Italy, was the ultimate luxury fabric and heavily restricted. Only the nobility and the very wealthiest merchants, and even then, sometimes only their wives, were typically permitted to wear it. Velvet brocade cloth of gold, which literally had gold threads woven into it, and fine furs like ermine, that white fur with the black spots, classic royal attire, or sable, were also high on the do not touch unless you are Duke list. For the vast majority, it was wool and more wool. And even then, the quality of the wool was differentiated. Coarse, undyed homespun for the peasants, finer dyed wools for artisans and merchants. Linen was common for undergarments for all classes, but again, the fineness of the weave would vary. Trying to pass off your slightly less scratchy wool as merchant grade, when you were in fact a humble pig keeper, could land you in trouble. The fashion police might not have had DNA testing, but you can bet there were material witnesses to your clothing crimes. Trimmings and embellishments were another battleground. The amount of fur you could use, whether you could have gold or silver embroidery, the number and size of pearls or gemstones on your gown, all meticulously legislated. The length of a knight's spurs, the size of a lady's headdress, the number of slashes or pinks in a doublet, those decorative cuts that showed a contrasting lining could all be dictated by law. Some German sumptuary laws from the 15th century, for instance, went into incredible detail about how many rules of ruching or pleats were permissible on a woman's collar based on her husband's income or social standing. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily designed to curb the expenditure of the newly wealthy merchant class, who were increasingly able to afford the trappings of nobility and thus threatened to blur the carefully constructed social lines. If a wealthy wool merchant could dress his wife in silks and jewels that rivaled those of a countess, how could anyone tell who was really important anymore? It was a genuine concern for the established aristocracy, or was it more about protecting local industries by forbidding the common folk from wearing, say, imported Flemish lace? Perhaps the laws aimed to boost the sales of good old English wool. And who was making these rules? Kings, queens, princes, city councils, guilds. Basically anyone with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo or controlling the economy. The laws were proclaimed, written down often in excruciating detail, and then it was up to local officials, like our friend, the wardrobe watcher, to enforce them. A quirky tidbit: some Italian city-states were particularly enthusiastic about sumptuary laws. Florence, a hub of textile production and banking, had incredibly detailed regulations. They even had officials specifically tasked with inspecting wedding trousseaux to ensure they didn't exceed the legal limits on value or luxury. Imagine having your lingerie drawer inspected by a city official before your wedding. How romantic. So as you stand there, accused by your crimson shoes, you're not just dealing with one grumpy official. You're up against a whole system, a legal framework designed to keep you and your feet firmly in your designated social box. It's a system that believes What you wear on the outside perfectly reflects who you are on the inside, and woe betide you if you try to dress up your reality. The irony, of course, is that the word sumptuous today means lavish and expensive, precisely what these laws were trying to control. It's enough to make you want to go barefoot, if only that weren't also, probably, regulated. The wardrobe watcher taps his foot impatiently, perhaps shod in a very sensible regulation, brown stout leather shoe with absolutely no pretensions to fashion or frivolity. His very footwear screams, "I am a man of modest station, upholding the rules that keep society from unraveling into a chaotic mess of velvet-clad peasants and silk-stockinged swineherds." Or maybe he's just got a stone in it. But why all this fuss? Why did rulers from kings down to town mayors care so profoundly about what you, a seemingly insignificant individual, decided to put on your feet or drape over your shoulders? The reasons are a complex tapestry, woven from threads of power, piety, economics, and a healthy dose of good old-fashioned social anxiety. One of the primary drivers, as you've probably gathered, was the preservation of power and the existing social hierarchy. In a world where birthright was paramount and your station in life was largely fixed from the moment you drew your first breath, visual cues were everything. How else could you tell at a glance who was important and who wasn't? Who deserved deference and who could be bossed around clothing was the most immediate and universally understood signifier of rank. A nobleman's ermine-trimmed cloak or a bishop's purple cassock weren't just fancy dress. They were declarations of authority, instantly recognizable symbols of their place at the top of the pecking order. If a wealthy merchant started sporting similar attire, it wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a subtle challenge to that established order. It was like saying, "My money makes me as good as you," which to a hereditary aristocrat was an outrageous and dangerous idea. Think of it as an early form of brand protection for the nobility. You wouldn't want someone selling counterfeit royal insignia, would you? Well, dressing above your station was seen in a similar light. A counterfeit claim to status. This ties into the concept of the great chain of being, a pervasive medieval worldview that saw all of creation arranged in a divinely ordained hierarchy from God at the very top down through angels, kings, nobles, commoners, animals, plants, and even inanimate objects. Each had its place, its duties, and its appropriate level of dignity. Messing with this order by, say, a commoner wearing the silks reserved for a duchess was seen as not just socially disruptive, but almost unnatural. It was an affront to God's plan. This is where piety comes into the picture. The church, a hugely influential force in medieval life, often threw its considerable weight behind sumptuary laws. Moralists and preachers frequently railed against undue luxury, viewing excessive spending on clothes as a sign of vanity pride, one of the 7 deadly sins, remember, and a dangerous distraction from spiritual matters. They argued that focusing on earthly finery led people away from God and encouraged a decadent, immoral lifestyle. Lavish dress was seen as particularly problematic for women who were often portrayed as temptresses using fine clothes and jewels to lure men into sin. So sumptuary laws could be framed as a way to promote virtue, modesty, and godliness among the populace. Dress plainly, think purely was the subtext. It's a bit like those old school uniform rules, designed to stop kids from peacocking and focus on their studies only on a societal scale, with eternal salvation or damnation supposedly at stake. Of course, the church itself wasn't always a model of sartorial austerity. High-ranking clergy often wore incredibly rich vestments made of silks, brocades, and cloth of gold adorned with precious gems. This, however, was justified as being for the glory of God, not for personal vanity. The splendor of the church was meant to reflect the splendor of heaven. It's a classic, do as I say, not as I do situation, or perhaps it's different when we do it because we're special. This apparent hypocrisy wasn't lost on contemporary critics, by the way. Satirists and reformers often pointed out the stark contrast between the church's condemnation of luxury and the opulent lifestyles of some of its leaders. Beyond maintaining social order and promoting piety, there were often strong economic motivations for sumptuary laws. A mainstream historical fact is that many sumptuary laws aim to curb the outflow of bullion, gold and silver, to foreign lands. Luxury fabrics like silk fine linens from Flanders or exotic furs often had to be imported, and paying for them drained local economies of precious metals. By restricting who could buy these imported goods, rulers hoped to keep more wealth within their own kingdoms or city-states. It was a form of protectionism medieval style. If only the very elite could buy imported silk, then perhaps more people would buy locally produced, wool-boosting domestic industries and keeping local weavers and merchants employed. Some laws explicitly forbade the wearing of certain foreign-made goods altogether or imposed heavy taxes on them. It's not a million miles away from modern buy local campaigns, just with more legal teeth and less choice for the consumer. Historians still argue whether the primary economic aim was to control the balance of trade, or if it was more about protecting specific influential guilds. Textile guilds, for example, were often very powerful and could lobby rulers to pass laws that favored their products over foreign competitors or even over other local industries. If the wool weavers guild was particularly influential in a town, they might push for laws restricting the use of linen or silk, regardless of the broader economic impact. It's a reminder that even in the Middle Ages, lobbying and special interest groups were alive and well. Another, perhaps less obvious reason for controlling dress was for identification and social control in a more general sense. In an era before widespread literacy or official ID cards, clothing was an instant identifier. It could signal not just your social rank, but also your profession, your marital status, or even your religion. For example, in some areas, Jews and Muslims were legally required to wear specific badges or items of clothing, like particular hats or colored patches, to distinguish them from the Christian population. This was often a discriminatory measure, making them easily identifiable and sometimes vulnerable to persecution. Similarly, prostitutes were sometimes forced to wear distinctive clothing, perhaps striped hoods or yellow bands, so they couldn't be mistaken for respectable women. So, controlling dress wasn't just about stopping social climbers. It was about categorizing and in some cases marginalizing entire groups of people. And finally, let's not forget the simple desire of rulers to demonstrate their power. What better way to show you're in charge than by dictating the most personal aspects of your subjects' lives right down to their shoe buckles? Enforcing sumptuary laws was a visible assertion of authority. Every time a wardrobe watcher finds someone for wearing an illegal feather in their cap, it was a little reminder who made the rules. A quirky tidbit: some rulers took a very personal interest in these matters. Queen Elizabeth II of England, for instance, was famously particular about the enforcement of sumptuary laws, issuing numerous proclamations and even, according to some accounts, accosting courtiers whose ruffs were too large or whose doublets were too outrageously padded. Imagine the Queen herself giving you a dressing down for your fashion choices. Talk about pressure. So, the reasons behind these laws were manifold: to keep the nobles noble looking and the peasants peasant looking, to save souls from the sin of vanity, to keep gold from flowing out of the country, to protect local jobs, to identify and control various groups, and to just generally remind everyone he was boss. It makes your illegal crimson shoes seem like a very small cog in a very large, very complex machine of social and political control. And you, my friend, are currently caught in its gears. The wardrobe watcher is still there, an unmoving monument to medieval bureaucracy, his gaze fixed on your offending footwear. You can almost hear the mental cogs turning as he calculates the fine, perhaps with a small internal sigh for the paperwork this will inevitably generate. This whole uncomfortable encounter, this meticulous scrutiny of your attire, isn't just about him being a job's worth. It's about maintaining the visible, tangible structure of society. Your clothes in this era are not merely a personal choice. They are a public statement, a thread woven directly into the social fabric. And if that thread is the wrong color, the wrong material, or even just a bit too flashy, it's seen as a potential snag that could unravel the whole carefully constructed pattern. Imagine society as a vast, intricate tapestry. Each person, from the king on his throne to the beggar in the street, has a designated place within the design, and their clothing is the primary way their position in that design is colored and made visible to all. It's an instant visual shorthand. You see someone in coarse, undyed wool, patched and worn, and you immediately know their place is likely at the lower end of the social spectrum. You see shimmering silks, rich velvets, and the glint of gold thread, and you know you're in the presence of someone from the upper echelons. There's no need for introductions or business cards. The outfit speaks volumes often louder than they dare. It's like a uniform, but for your entire life, not just your job. This visual demarcation was crucial for reinforcing the deeply hierarchical nature of medieval society. It wasn't just about snobbery, though there was plenty of that to go around. It was about order, stability, and everyone knowing their role and responsibilities. If a peasant could dress like a lord, it might, the thinking went, encourage him to act like a lord, to become uppity, to question his lot in life, to perhaps even challenge the authority of his actual superiors. And that in a society built on deference and inherited privilege was a terrifying prospect. Keeping people visually in their place was a way of keeping them mentally and behaviorally in their place too. It's a bit like how, even today, certain professions have dress codes. You expect your surgeon to be in scrubs, not a clown costume, because their attire signals their role and hopefully their competence. In the Middle Ages, this principle was applied to society as a whole. The details were often incredibly specific, creating a complex visual language that everyone was expected to understand. It wasn't just about rich versus poor. There were subtle distinctions within classes. For example, within the merchant class, a wealthy international trader might be permitted finer wools or more elaborate trimmings than a local shopkeeper. The wife of a master craftsman might be allowed certain adornments forbidden to the wife of an apprentice. University scholars had their own distinctive gowns, signaling their learning. Clergy members, as we've noted, had their elaborate system of vestments differentiating ranks from the humble parish priest to the powerful cardinal. Even within the nobility there were gradations. A duke's allowance for ermine trim might be more generous than that afforded to a mere baron. It was a sartorial league table, and everyone was constantly, if unconsciously, checking their position and that of others. A mainstream historical fact is that guilds often played a significant role in regulating the dress of their own members. This wasn't just about adhering to external sumptuary laws. It was also about maintaining the guild's reputation and internal hierarchy. A master goldsmith, for instance, would be expected to dress in a manner befitting his status and the wealth he handled. But an apprentice in the same guild would be expected to dress much more modestly. Guild regulations might specify the quality of cloth, the colors permitted, and even the number of buttons on a tunic for different ranks within the guild. This helped to reinforce the guild's own internal order and present a united, respectable front to the outside world. They were in effect their own mini-fashion police, ensuring their members didn't bring the craft into disrepute by dressing too poorly or cause resentment by dressing too lavishly above their station within the guild. The idea was that your outward appearance should reflect your inner worth and your God-given place in the world. If you tried to dress above your station, you were not only accused of pride and presumption, but also of trying to deceive others. You were presenting a false image of yourself. It was a form of social counterfeiting. This concern with authenticity, with appearance matching reality, was deeply ingrained. There was a genuine belief that if the visual distinctions between classes were allowed to blur, society itself would become disordered and chaotic. It's hard for us to grasp in our world of fast fashion and individual expression how tightly clothing and identity were bound together. Today, you might wear ripped jeans and a t-shirt, whether you're a billionaire tech mogul or a student. Back then, such ambiguity would have been deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether the relentless focus on controlling the dress of the lower and middling classes was more about the aristocracy's fear of losing their distinctiveness or about a genuine belief in a divinely ordained social order. Were they truly terrified that society would collapse if a baker wore velvet, or were they just annoyed that their exclusive status symbols were being encroached upon by the nouveau riche? It's likely a bit of both. The rise of a wealthy merchant class, particularly in booming urban centers, definitely put pressure on traditional social structures. These merchants, with their growing economic power, could often afford the same luxuries as the old landed nobility, and they weren't shy about showing it. This was a source of considerable tension and a key driver for the proliferation and increasingly frantic enforcement of sumptuary laws. The laws were in part an attempt by the old guard to shore up their eroding visual dominance. And it wasn't just about stopping the lower orders from dressing up. Sometimes sumptuary laws also aimed to prevent the nobility from bankrupting themselves through competitive extravagance. Nobles were often under immense pressure to maintain a lavish lifestyle, to display their wealth and status through their clothing, their retinues, and their hospitality. This could lead to ruinous spending, especially during major events like royal weddings, tournaments, or coronations. So, occasionally sumptuary laws would also set upper limits on the expenditure of the nobility themselves, trying to curb the excesses that could lead to debt and the loss of ancestral lands. It was a delicate balance. Nobles needed to look noble, but not so noble that they ended up broke. A quirky tidbit for you: in some parts of Europe, particularly in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, there were even attempts to regulate the newness of clothing. Laws might specify that certain garments could only be worn for a certain number of years before being deemed too old or shabby for a person of a particular rank. Conversely, there were sometimes restrictions on how frequently one could purchase new outfits, especially expensive ones, to discourage frivolous spending. Imagine a law that says your best doublet is only socially acceptable for 3 years, after which you must either downgrade its use or risk a fine for looking insufficiently prosperous for your station. Or, sir, this is your 3rd new hat this month. The proclamation on headwear clearly states a maximum of 1 new hat per quarter for gentlemen of your standing. That'll be 10 groats. The sheer micromanagement is mind-boggling. So, as you stand there wilting under the official stare, remember that your shoes are not just shoes. They are a statement. They are a symbol. They are a tiny, crimson-dyed challenge to a system that demands your clothes tell a very specific story about who you are and where you belong. The social fabric in their eyes is a delicate thing, easily torn by an inappropriately colored shoe or an overly ambitious velvet hat, and the wardrobe watchers are the needle and thread, constantly trying to stitch it back together, one fine at a time. The official's eyes, you notice, are a rather dull, sensible brown, much like his probably very regulation-issue shoes. They certainly aren't sparkling with the forbidden allure of, say, Tyrian purple or even a cheeky scarlet. Color, you see, was king in the medieval fashion police state. It wasn't just about whether a fabric was silk or wool. The hue itself was laden with meaning, status, and a whole host of legal restrictions. Wearing the wrong color could be a more blatant, more immediate offense than even the material it was dyed on. It was a visual scream in a world that preferred polite, socially sanctioned whispers. Let's start at the top of the chromatic hierarchy: purple. Specifically, Tyrian purple. This legendary dye, painstakingly extracted from the glands of certain sea snails, the murex, brandaris, and relatives, was astronomically expensive. Thousands upon thousands of snails were needed to produce even a small amount of the dye, a process that was both labor-intensive and frankly rather smelly, involving vats of rotting shellfish. The resulting color, however, was a deep, rich, light, fast purple that didn't fade, and it became inextricably linked with imperial power in the Roman Empire. This association carried right through into the Byzantine Empire and medieval Europe. Wearing Tyrian purple, or anything approximating it, was a bold claim. It was the color of emperors, of kings, of the highest echelons of the church. For anyone else to don, it was seen as an act of outrageous presumption, bordering on treason. Sumptuary laws were incredibly strict about purple. Unless you were literally sitting on a throne or were a cardinal, you could pretty much forget it. Even a tiny ribbon of the stuff could get you into serious trouble. It was the ultimate look but don't touch color. Then there was scarlet. Not just any red, but a specific, vibrant and costly scarlet, often derived from the kermes, insects which lived on certain species of oak trees. Harvesting these tiny insects and processing them into dye was another expensive undertaking. Scarlet, like purple, became a high status color, often associated with the nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking officials. Laws would carefully delineate who was permitted to wear scarlet and in what quantity. Perhaps a nobleman could have a full scarlet cloak, while a prosperous merchant might be allowed scarlet lining in his doublet, and a lesser official maybe just scarlet hose. The intensity and purity of the red mattered. A dull brick red dyed with madder root, a much cheaper and more common plant-based dye, was perfectly acceptable for the lower classes. But the brilliant insect-derived scarlet was a different matter entirely. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a Ferrari versus a sensible family sedan. Both get you from A to B, but one screams money and status much louder. Blue too had its own hierarchy. The most prized blue in the earlier medieval period came from woad, a plant that required a complex and rather pungent fermentation process involving urine charmingly enough to yield its color. Later, indigo imported from the East offered a richer, more stable blue, but it was also more expensive. Fine deep blues were often restricted associated with royalty. Think of the blue in many royal coats of arms, or signifying wealth and stability. Lighter, duller, or grayer blues, achievable with less concentrated woad or cheaper dyestuffs, were more permissible for the general populace. So your bright blue shoes, if they were a particularly vivid shade, might indeed have crossed a line. It wasn't just blue, it was what kind of blue, and how dare you. Green was another color whose status depended on the quality of the dye. Rich, vibrant greens, often achieved by a complex double dyeing process, first blue with woad or indigo, then yellow with a plant dye like weld or dyer's broom, could be expensive and thus restricted. Less vibrant, more olive or murky greens made with cheaper single plant dyes were more common. There's a quirky tidbit for you. Green was sometimes associated with youth, love, and springtime, but also, paradoxically, with fickleness and even poison due to some unstable copper-based green pigments. So wearing green could be a bit of a sartorial gamble depending on the shade and the local interpretation. It was like the medieval equivalent of wearing a band t-shirt. It could mean you're a cool insider or just trying too hard. And what about the humble hues, browns, grays, and undyed fabrics, often called russet, if it was coarse wool, or just white, if it was undyed linen or fine wool, were generally the domain of the peasantry and the lower orders. These colors were cheap to produce, or required no dyeing at all, and they conveniently also showed dirt less easily, which was practical for people engaged in manual labor. Sumptuary laws often didn't bother to restrict these colors, as they were inherently low status. If anything, the laws sometimes mandated that certain groups wear these drab colors to emphasize their lowly position. It was a way of saying, you are the color of the earth you till. Black is an interesting case. In the earlier Middle Ages, good deep black was actually a difficult and expensive color to achieve. Most blacks were more like dark grays or browns. True rich black often required complex dyeing processes, sometimes involving iron mordants that could also weaken the fabric. However, by the later Middle Ages, particularly in the 15th century, improved dyeing techniques made rich black more accessible, and it became fashionable among wealthy merchants and courtiers, especially in places like Burgundy and Italy. It signified sobriety, dignity, and a certain austere elegance. Because it was still relatively costly to do well, it could be a status symbol in itself, and sumptuary laws might restrict the quality of black fabric, e.g., fine black wool versus coarse black wool, or the use of black velvet, which was particularly luxurious. So while today we think of black as a universally versatile and often slimming color, in the medieval period, its status and symbolism were more fluid and depended on the era and the quality of the dye. A mainstream historical fact is that the cost of dyes was a major factor in their regulation. Dyes often had to be imported over long distances. Kermes from the Mediterranean, indigo from India, certain rare dye roots from Africa or the East. This made them valuable commodities, and their use was naturally limited to those who could afford them. Sumptuary laws simply codified this economic reality, adding a legal layer of restriction on top of the financial one. It wasn't just that a peasant couldn't afford a purple robe. He was legally forbidden from wearing one, even if by some miracle he stumbled upon a pot of gold. Historians still argue whether the symbolism of colors was universally understood across all of Europe or if there were significant regional variations. While certain colors like Tyrian purple had a fairly widespread imperial association, the specific meanings and restrictions of other colors could differ from one kingdom or even one city to another. Local availability of dyestuffs, local traditions, and the specific concerns of local rulers could all influence how colors were regulated and perceived. What was a restricted color in England might be more permissible in parts of Germany or vice versa. This patchwork of regulations must have made traveling a sartorial minefield. Imagine crossing a border and suddenly finding your perfectly legal green tunic is now an outrageous offense. Welcome to Burgundy. That'll be 20 florins for the tunic, sir. So, as you stand there, your vibrant shoes feeling more like a neon sign, advertising your transgression, you realize the official isn't just being picky. He's upholding a whole chromatic code, a rainbow of regulations that dictate social standing. Each shade tells a story, and your story, according to him, is being told in a color that's far too loud, far too proud for your chapter in the great book of medieval society. The world was not in black and white, but the approved palette for your wardrobe was definitely limited edition. The official's gaze, still firmly on your shoes, seems to penetrate the very leather, assessing not just their forbidden color, but also the quality of the material itself. Because it wasn't only about the rainbow of regulated hues, the actual stuff your clothes were made of was just as crucial in the eyes of the sumptuary law enforcers. You could be wearing the most legally drab brown imaginable, but if that brown was rendered in, say, luxurious silk velvet, when you were meant to be a humble purveyor of parsnips, you'd be in just as much hot water. It was a material world, and the materials you draped yourself in spoke volumes about your place within it. At the absolute pinnacle of the fabric hierarchy was silk. For centuries, the secrets of silk production were jealously guarded by China, making it an incredibly exotic and costly import in Europe. Caravans traveling the Silk Road brought this shimmering, lightweight, and incredibly strong fabric west, and its price reflected its arduous journey and rarity. Even after sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms spread to the Byzantine Empire, and then, much later, to parts of Italy and southern France, silk remained a symbol of ultimate luxury. It was soft, it took dyes beautifully, and it had a lustrous sheen that no other fabric could match. Sumptuary laws almost universally restricted silk to the highest nobility royalty, and sometimes the very wealthiest echelons of the merchant class, often with caveats. perhaps only for women of that class or only for certain garments. To wear a full silk gown, if you weren't in this elite club, was the height of presumption. It was like turning up to a village fete in a couture ball gown. You'd definitely get noticed, and not in a good way. Then there were the even more extravagant variations of silk velvet with its plush, dense pile, damask with its subtly woven patterns, brocade interwoven with gold or silver threads, creating dazzling, opulent designs. Cloth of gold and cloth of silver were literally fabrics woven with precious metal, making them phenomenally expensive and incredibly heavy. These were the fabrics of kings and emperors, reserved for ceremonial occasions or to display overwhelming power and wealth. A mainstream historical fact is that the field of the cloth of gold in 1520, a magnificent meeting between King Henry VIII of England and King Francis I of France, was named for the sheer amount of this incredibly expensive fabric used in the tents, pavilions, and clothing of the attendees. The ostentatious display was a deliberate act of political one-upmanship, with both kings trying to outdo each other in splendor. For anyone of lesser rank to even dream of wearing such materials was of course unthinkable and utterly illegal. Below these almost mythical fabrics came the various grades of wool. Wool was the workhorse fabric of medieval Europe, worn by almost everyone in some form or another. But crucially, not all wool was created equal. There was a vast difference between the coarse, scratchy, often undyed wool, known as homespun or russet, worn by peasants and laborers, and the fine, soft, expertly woven and dyed wools, produced in regions like Flanders or England. These high-quality wools, sometimes referred to as broadcloth, could be incredibly expensive, rivaling cheaper silks in price. Sumptuary laws would therefore differentiate. A peasant might be legally required to wear coarse wool, while a prosperous townsman or a lesser noble could wear finer wools. The laws might specify the price per yard of wool that different classes were allowed to wear. It was a subtle but important distinction. Your wool might be brown just like the peasants, but if it was a fine brown wool that still marked you out as being a step or two above. Linen derived from the flax plant was another common fabric, primarily used for undergarments, shirts, shifts, brayers, which were like loose under trousers, coifs, close-fitting caps, veils, and household textiles like sheets and tablecloths. Like wool, linen came in various qualities, from coarse, rough, canvas-like material to incredibly fine, almost translucent cambric or lawn. Finer linens were more expensive and might be restricted, while everyone from peasant to king likely wore linen. Next to their skin, it was more comfortable and easier to wash than wool. The quality and fineness of that linen would have been a clear indicator of status. Imagine the difference between a rough, unbleached linen shirt and a soft snow white one made from the finest imported flax. One is purely functional. The other is a quiet statement of luxury. Furs were another area of intense regulation. Fur was used for warmth, of course, but it was also a major status symbol. At the very top were ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, with its distinctive black tail tip, and sable, a dark, lustrous fur from a type of marten. These were almost exclusively reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Wearing ermine, if you weren't entitled to it, was a massive no-no. Below these came other expensive furs like fox marten, other than sable and squirrel. Squirrel fur, particularly the white belly fur known as miniver or veil, was very popular and often painstakingly pieced together to create striking patterned linings or trims. Less prestigious, but still subject to some regulation, were furs like rabbit, beaver, otter, and lambskin, sometimes called budge. The cheapest and most common furs like wolf or cat might be permissible for lower classes, but even then, sometimes only as a lining, not as an ostentatious outer trim. The laws would specify not just the type of fur, but also where on a garment it could be worn, e.g. on the cuffs, the collar, or as a full lining and by whom. A merchant might be allowed a rabbit fur lining, but a full sable collar would be out of the question. It's like having a rule that says you can have cloth seats in your car, but leather is only for the CEO. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of restricting materials like silk and fine furs was purely to maintain social distinctions, or if it was significantly driven by the desire to protect and promote local wool industries. England, for example, was a major producer of high-quality wool, which was a cornerstone of its economy. Laws that restricted the wearing of imported silks could be seen as a way to encourage the consumption of English wool, both at home and abroad, as English wool was also a major export. It's a classic case of, is it social control or economic policy? And the answer is probably yes, both. And what about your shoes? The material of your footwear was also under scrutiny. Fine leathers like cordwain, a high-quality goatskin leather, originally from Cordoba, Spain, hence the name, cordwainer, for a shoemaker, or supple calfskin might be restricted to the wealthier classes. Poorer folk would have made do with tougher, coarser cowhide or sheepskin. Sometimes even the method of tanning or finishing the leather could be a factor. There's a quirky tidbit. In some areas, there were even regulations about shoe soles. Peasants or laborers might be restricted to wooden-soled clogs or shoes with thick, utilitarian leather soles, while the gentry could wear thinner, more elegant soles, perhaps even made of layered leather or in some extreme indoor fashions fabric. You wouldn't want to do much farm work in delicate silk-soled slippers, but they certainly signaled a life of leisure. So if your offending crimson shoes were also made of a particularly fine imported leather, that would be another black mark against you in the wardrobe watcher's mental ledger. It wasn't just one thing. It was the cumulative effect of color, material, style, and embellishment. Each element was a piece of the puzzle, and if too many pieces didn't fit your legally assigned social picture, the penalties could mount up. You weren't just breaking one rule, you were committing a whole symphony of sartorial sins. The medieval fashion police were very thorough. They knew their weaves, their worth, and whether your wool was wannabe wealthy or suitably subdued. Our long-suffering wardrobe watcher, having mentally catalogued the illegal color and potentially problematic material of your shoes, now lets his gaze drift to their very shape. Because, oh yes, even the style of your footwear, particularly the length and pointiness of your toes, could be a serious felony in the eyes of medieval law. You might think that after color and fabric, they'd give your poor feet a break. But no, the medieval obsession with regulating every conceivable aspect of appearance extended right down to your tiptoes. The prime offender in the footwear fashion crime category was a style of shoe known as the Krakow or poulain. Picture this, a shoe that extends into a long, often absurdly long, pointed toe, sometimes so exaggerated that it curled up or even had to be tied to the wearer's knee with a delicate chain or ribbon to prevent tripping. Yes, you heard that right. Shoes so pointy, they required their own support system. This fashion statement which originated in Poland hence. Poulaine, from the French term souliers à la polonaise, or shoes in the Polish style. And Krakow, from Krakow, swept across Europe from the late 14th century to much of the 15th century, becoming a bizarre obsession among the fashionable elite, particularly men. It's one of those fashion trends like shoulder pads in the 80s or skinny jeans in the 2000s that seems utterly baffling in retrospect, but was the absolute height of cool at the time. These points weren't just a subtle curve. They could be incredibly elongated. We're talking toes extending 6 inches a foot, or even in the most extreme cases up to 2 feet beyond the actual foot. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded street, go upstairs, or heaven forbid, kneel in church with an extra 2 feet of shoe sticking out in front of you. It was impractical, it was ridiculous, and therefore naturally it became a massive status symbol. The longer your point, the less likely you were to be engaging in any form of manual labor. It was a walking or perhaps carefully shuffling advertisement of your leisured aristocratic lifestyle. Look at me. These shoes screamed, I don't need to do anything useful. Of course the authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, had a field day with Krakowis. Moralists condemned them as vain, decadent, and even phallic symbols, earning them the rather unsubtle nickname Devil's Fingers from some scandalized preachers. They were seen as an affront to God and a clear sign of societal decay. The church in particular railed against them, sometimes even threatening excommunication for those who dared to sport overly long points within sacred precincts. Imagine being barred from church because your shoes were too pointy. It's a whole new level of dress code, strictly enforced. Secular rulers, ever keen to regulate status, quickly jumped on the Krakow condemning bandwagon. Sumptuary laws were enacted across Europe to limit the length of these shoe points based on social rank. A mainstream historical fact is that in England, during the reign of King Edward IV in the 1460s, a law was passed stipulating that no knight under the rank of a lord, nor any esquire gentleman or other person should wear shoes or boots with pikes, points exceeding 2 inches in length. If you dared to flaunt a 3-inch point and weren't a lord, you could face a hefty fine, 20 shillings, a considerable sum at the time, and the offending shoes could be confiscated. Shoemakers were also fined for daring to make such illegal points for those not entitled to them. This law and others like it across Europe essentially created a pointometer of social standing. A king or a high duke might be permitted the most extravagant lengths, while a mere merchant or a commoner would be restricted to a mere nub, if any point at all. It was social hierarchy, measured in inches of leather. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for banning or restricting Krakowers was moral outrage, a desire to enforce social distinctions, or simple practicality. While the moral and social arguments were certainly prominent, there's also a case to be made that these shoes were just genuinely dangerous and impractical. Imagine trying to fight in a battle or even just walk briskly with those things on. They were a trip hazard extraordinaire. There are even some possibly apocryphal accounts of knights at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 having to cut off the points of their poulaines before they could effectively engage in combat. Whether true or not, it highlights the sheer unwieldiness of the fashion. Perhaps the laws were in part a medieval public safety announcement, trim your toes, save your neck. But Krakowers weren't the only footwear fashion to attract legal attention. Other aspects of shoe style could also be regulated. The height of heels, for example, particularly for women's shoes, in later periods, though high heels, as we know them, were more of a Renaissance and early modern phenomenon, would be restricted. Chopin's those towering platform shoes, popular in Venice and Spain in the 15th to 17th centuries, could reach absurd heights, sometimes over 20 inches. While primarily worn by women, often courtesans or noblewomen, they too were seen as extravagant and impractical, and attempts were made to limit their height. Walking in them was an art form in itself, often requiring attendants to support the wearer. Even the fastenings of your shoes could come under scrutiny. Ornate buckles made of precious metals like silver or gold might be forbidden to those of lower status. The number of eyelets for laces, or the material of the laces themselves, silk laces for instance, could be specified. It was all part of the comprehensive effort to ensure that every detail of your attire, right down to how you fastened your shoes, accurately reflected your station. A quirky tidbit: some medieval illustrations and surviving examples of crackaways show that the points were sometimes stuffed with moss wool or hair to help them keep their shape. Imagine having to stuff your shoes, not because they were too big, but because the fashion demanded an artificially elongated and likely rather floppy toe. The dedication to looking fashionable, even at the expense of comfort and practicality, is clearly not a modern invention. It makes you wonder what future generations will think of some of our current fashion choices. Will they look back at stilettos or platform sneakers with the same bewildered amusement we reserve for crackaways? So if your illegal crimson shoes also happen to have a toe that's just a smidge too pointy for your legally defined social standing, perhaps you're sporting a daring 1-inch point when the law for your class clearly states a maximum of half an inch. Then you've just added another charge to your fashion rap sheet. The wardrobe watcher might even get out a little measuring stick. Let's see here. Yup, that's a class 3-point violation. That's another 5 groats plus confiscation of the offending articles. It's enough to make you want to go barefoot, but even that might have been interpreted as a statement, perhaps one of extreme poverty or religious asceticism, which could also be problematic if it wasn't your assigned look. There was truly no escape from the all-seeing eye of the medieval fashion police, right down to the tips of your toes. All right, so there you stand, convicted by color material and perhaps even the audacious pointiness of your shoes. Your heart is doing a frantic jig against your ribs, and you're probably wondering who exactly is this person with the power to ruin your day and empty your coin purse over a pair of unfortunate footwear choices. Who were these wardrobe watchers, these sartorial sentinels tasked with upholding the often bewilderingly complex sumptuary laws? It wasn't usually a dedicated full-time fashion police force, as we might jokingly imagine it with sirens wailing for crimes of crimson. Rather, the enforcement of these laws fell to a variety of existing individuals whose job description suddenly included apparel auditor alongside their more mundane duties. In towns and cities, the responsibility often lay with municipal officials, mayors, aldermen, bailiffs, town council members. These were the local bigwigs who were expected to ensure that the king's or duke's or prince bishop's proclamations on dress were being followed within their jurisdiction. They might conduct periodic inspections, perhaps walking through the marketplace or observing attendees at public events, their eyes peeled for illegal silks or overly ostentatious hats. Imagine the mayor, instead of cutting a ribbon to open a new bridge, sidling up to you and saying, "Excuse me, madam, is that genuine squirrel fur on your cuffs?" As per the Edict of 73, only beaver is permitted for persons of your guild affiliation. It adds a whole new layer of civic duty. Sometimes specific individuals were appointed with the express task of monitoring adherence to sumptuary laws, at least for a certain period or in a particular area. These could be temporary commissioners or specially designated local officers. They might be granted the authority to issue warnings, levy fines, and even confiscate offending garments on the spot. These were the guys you really didn't want to run into if you were pushing the boundaries of your wardrobe allowance. They were the ones who likely took their role with a certain grim satisfaction, the ones who knew the regulations chapter and verse, possibly because they'd had to memorize the latest 50-page edict on permissible sleeve widths. Guilds, as we've touched upon, often played a significant role in policing their own members. Master craftsmen within a guild might be responsible for ensuring that apprentices, journeymen, and even other masters dressed in a manner appropriate to their rank within the guild and within society at large. This was partly about upholding the guild's reputation. They didn't want their members looking too poor, which might reflect badly on the craft, nor too rich, which might attract unwelcome attention from higher authorities or stir up resentment. It was also about maintaining internal discipline and hierarchy within the guild itself. An apprentice who dared to dress like a master was not just breaking a sumptuary law, he was disrespecting the established order of his trade. So, your own boss or a senior colleague could, in effect, be your personal fashion enforcer. Talk about a difficult annual review. Your productivity is up, Johnson, but your hat feathers are still far too flamboyant for a man in your position. We'll need to see some improvement there. In rural areas, enforcement might fall to local lords, reeves, a lord's official or estate manager, or other manorial officials. These individuals would be responsible for keeping an eye on the peasantry and tenant farmers within their domain. Given the generally limited resources of the rural poor, egregious violations of sumptuary laws regarding luxury fabrics were probably less common, but issues like the quality of wool, the use of certain dyes, or perhaps an overly ambitious buckle on a belt could still attract attention. It's harder to imagine a reeve meticulously measuring shoe points in the middle of a muddy field, but if a peasant showed up at the manor court wearing something clearly above his station, questions would certainly be asked. And what about at the royal court itself? Here enforcement was often more direct and personal. Kings, queens, and high-ranking nobles were surrounded by courtiers whose appearance was a direct reflection of the monarch's own power and splendor. While courtiers were expected to dress magnificently, they also had to be careful not to outshine the monarch or wear items specifically reserved for royalty. A mainstream historical fact is that court officials, such as the Lord Chamberlain or Masters of the Wardrobe, would have been responsible for overseeing courtly attire and etiquette. They would have advised on appropriate dress and subtly, or not so subtly, corrected anyone who stepped out of line. Queen Elizabeth Gwyn, as mentioned, was famously eagle-eyed about such matters and wouldn't hesitate to comment directly if a courtier's ruff was too large or their jewels too ostentatious for their rank. Imagine the sheer terror of getting a fashion critique from the Queen herself. You'd probably want the ground to swallow your doublet holes in. The church also played a role, though perhaps more through moral suasion than direct legal enforcement in the streets. Priests would preach from the pulpit against vanity and excessive luxury in dress, reminding their congregations of the spiritual dangers of worldly finery. Confessors might inquire about extravagant clothing as part of the sacrament of penance. While a priest couldn't typically fine you for wearing illegal shoes, the threat of divine displeasure or a lengthy penance could be a powerful motivator for some to dress more modestly. Sometimes ecclesiastical courts did have jurisdiction over certain moral offenses that could include aspects of dress, particularly if it was deemed scandalous or heretical. Historians still argue whether the enforcement of sumptuary laws was ever truly effective or if it was more of a symbolic gesture. Given the sheer number of laws passed and the frequency with which they were reissued or amended, it suggests that compliance was often a problem. People, it seems, have always had a desire to dress as well as they can afford, or sometimes even better, and they often found ways to bend or break the rules. Enforcement could be inconsistent, varying hugely by region, by the specific ruler in power, and by the zeal or lack thereof of individual officials. Some enforcers might be strict, others more lenient, perhaps open to a discreet bribe or willing to turn a blind eye for friends or influential citizens. It's the age-old story. Where there are rules, there are rule breakers, and where there are enforcers, there's often inconsistency. A quirky tidbit: some sumptuary laws actually offered a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card if you were willing to pay for the privilege. In certain Italian city-states, for example, individuals could sometimes purchase licenses or dispensations that allowed them to wear specific restricted items even if they weren't technically of the correct social rank. It was a way for the state to raise revenue while still notionally upholding the principle of social hierarchy. So if you were a wealthy merchant who desperately wanted his wife to wear a silk gown, you might be able to buy her the right to do so. It was a tacit admission that money could indeed sometimes trump birthright, at least when it came to fashion, as long as the state got its cut. It makes our modern luxury taxes seem almost quaint by comparison. So, the person scrutinizing your shoes could be anyone from the mayor himself to a specially appointed proctor commissioner, or even just a particularly officious local busybody with a bit of authority. They weren't a unified, uniformed force, but rather a diffuse network of individuals, all contributing in their own way to the grand and often frustrating project of keeping medieval society dressed appropriately. Shikasta. And right now you're the one caught in their carefully woven, legally binding net. The wardrobe watcher purses his lips, his internal abacus having clearly arrived at a sum that does not bode well for your immediate financial future. He's done with the inspection. Now comes the reckoning. What exactly happened when you were caught red-handed, or rather red-shirted, in a garment deemed illegal for your station? The punishments for violating sumptuary laws were varied, ranging from relatively minor financial penalties to public shaming, and even in some cases imprisonment, though that was rarer for a first-time footwear faux pas. It all depended on the severity of the offense, your social standing, ironically whether you were a repeat offender, and the specific laws of the region you happened to be in. The most common punishment, and the one you're probably bracing for, was a fine. These fines could vary enormously. For a minor infraction, perhaps your shoe points were just a little too long, or the fur trim on your cloak was of a slightly better quality than permitted. The fine might be manageable, though still annoying. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a parking ticket, a frustrating but not ruinous expense. However, for more blatant violations, like a commoner caught swaggering about in head-to-toe silk velvet of a restricted color, the fines could be astronomical. We're talking sums that could represent weeks or even months of income for an ordinary person. In some cases, the fine was calculated based on the value of the offending garment itself, sometimes double or even triple its cost. So not only did you lose the item, but you also paid a hefty penalty on top. It was a serious deterrent, or at least it was intended to be. Confiscation of the offending article was also a very common penalty, often in addition to a fine. So those beautiful illicitly crimson shoes you saved up for, poof, gone. They would be seized by the official and likely become the property of the town, the local lord, or even the crown. What happened to these confiscated clothes? Sometimes they were destroyed, particularly if they were seen as an egregious symbol of vanity. Other times they might be sold off, with the proceeds going into the public coffers or the official's pocket, depending on his level of integrity. There's a certain irony in the state profiting from the very luxury it was trying to suppress. In some instances, particularly with very valuable items like cloth of gold, they might even be repurposed, perhaps cut down and used for church vestments or other approved uses. So your scandalous shoes might have ended up adorning an altar, their sinful scarlet redeemed by ecclesiastical service. Public shaming was another potent weapon in the sumptuary law arsenal. Being publicly humiliated was a powerful social deterrent in a world where reputation was everything. If you were caught in a particularly flagrant violation, you might be paraded through the streets, perhaps wearing the offending garment or a mocking imitation of it, while a town crier announced your crime to your jeering neighbors. Imagine being forced to walk through the market square with a sign around your neck saying, "I wore illegal pointy shoes," or "Ask me about my presumptuous purple hat." It's the medieval version of being shamed on social media, but far more immediate and inescapable. Sometimes the offending garment itself might be publicly displayed, perhaps hung up in the town square as a warning to others. Your beautiful silk gown, now a tattered symbol of your folly for all to see. It's enough to make anyone stick to regulation. For repeat offenders, or for those whose violations were seen as particularly defiant or threatening to the social order, more severe penalties could be imposed. These might include significantly larger fines, longer periods of public shaming, or even in extreme cases, banishment from the town or city for a certain period. Imprisonment was generally less common for sumptuary offenses alone, unless they were combined with other crimes or seen as part of a broader pattern of defiance against authority. However, if you couldn't pay the hefty fines levied against you, you might well end up in debtor's prison, which was a grim prospect indeed. A mainstream historical fact is that the records of various towns and cities across Europe contain numerous entries detailing fines and confiscations for sumptuary law violations. These records provide concrete evidence of enforcement, listing the names of offenders, the nature of their offense, e.g., wearing a doublet of silk, contrary to the statute, possessing shoes with pikes longer than 2 inches, and the penalty imposed. These dry legal entries paint a vivid picture of the day-to-day reality of these laws in action. They show that it wasn't just an abstract legal concept. People really were being dinged for their dress. The severity of the punishment could also somewhat perversely depend on your own social status. While the laws were ostensibly designed to keep the lower orders from imitating their betters. Sometimes nobles who dressed below their station or in a manner deemed undignified could also face censure, though this was usually more a matter of social disapproval or rebuke from their peers or sovereign rather than a formal fine. However, if a commoner was found guilty, they often faced the full rigor of the law. There was little sympathy for a peasant who forgot his place and dared to wear velvet. Conversely, a wealthy merchant, while still subject to fines, might be able to absorb the cost more easily, or as we saw, even buy an exemption. This, of course, led to resentment and accusations that the laws were applied unfairly, disproportionately targeting those with fewer resources. It's the age-old cry, one law for the rich, another for the poor. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of these punishments was revenue generation for the authorities or genuine social control. While the rhetoric always emphasized maintaining order and morality, the substantial sums collected in fines in some jurisdictions suggest that sumptuary laws could be a handy source of income for civic or royal treasuries. Were they genuinely trying to stop people from wearing silk, or were they just happy to collect a silk tax every time someone got caught? The truth is likely a blend. The laws served both to reinforce social norms and to fill the coffers. A quirky tidbit. In some German cities, there were particularly creative and humiliating punishments. For instance, women caught wearing overly extravagant headdresses might have them forcibly removed and publicly destroyed, or they might be made to wear a shame mask, Schandmaske, that caricatured their vanity. There's one account of a woman in Nuremberg whose elaborate headdress, which violated local ordinances, was confiscated and nailed to the pillory as a public warning. Imagine your favorite hat ending up as a public spectacle of shame. It makes a bad hair day seem trivial in comparison. You wouldn't want your best bonnet to become a bonfire of the vanities, would you? So, as the wardrobe watcher delivers his verdict, you brace yourself. Will it be a simple fine that will leave you eating bread and water for a month? Will he demand you hand over your beloved if illegal shoes on the spot, or will you be subjected to the mortification of a public shaming your sartorial sin broadcast to the entire town? Whatever the penalty, it's a harsh reminder that in this world, your wardrobe choices are not your own. They belong to society, to the law, and to the ever-watchful eyes of men like the one standing before you, ready to exact the price for your moment of fashionable rebellion. Right, so the moment of truth has arrived. The wardrobe watcher, having completed his mental calculations and perhaps consulted a small, dog-eared booklet of regulations he keeps tucked in his sensible woolen tunic, names your crime and your punishment. Let's imagine, for the sake of our story, that your crimson shoes, crafted from suspiciously fine leather and boasting a toe that's a daring half-inch over the legal limit for someone of your, let's say, artisan status, have landed you a not insignificant fine, and alas, the confiscation of the offending footwear. You're caught, red-handed, or rather crimson-footed. He might begin with a sigh, as if the burden of enforcing these vital societal rules weighs heavily upon his stooped shoulders. Well, 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 he might intone, shaking his head slowly. Crimson Cordwain, is it? And are my old eyes deceiving me, or is that a full 1.5-inch point on those crackawers? The ordinance of last Michaelmas clearly states that for a cooper such as yourself, good sir, russet leather with a point not exceeding 1 inch is the prescribed limit. This is a clear contravention of Article 4, Paragraph 2. He sounds like he's reciting his shopping list, but to you it's the death knell for your dapper new shoes. You try to stammer an excuse. Perhaps you claim ignorance of the latest ordinance. They do seem to change with alarming frequency after all. But, Master Bailiff, you might plead it's always wise to use a respectful title, even if you're inwardly cursing his sensible brown boots. The merchant assured me these were perfectly acceptable. He said the new rules only applied to velvet slippers. This is, of course, a weak defense. Ignorance of the law, even in the 15th century, was rarely an acceptable excuse, especially when it came to sumptuary matters which were often publicly proclaimed. The wardrobe watcher probably just raises a skeptical eyebrow. The merchant, you say, perhaps we shall have a word with this merchant later, but your feet, sir, are in these shoes. Now, he then names the fine. That will be 10 shillings, and the shoes, of course, are forfeit to the city. 10 shillings. That's a huge sum. It could be a month's wages, maybe more. Your heart sinks. You think of the hours of extra work, the scrimping and saving that went into acquiring those shoes. And now, not only are they to be taken from you, but you have to pay a penalty that will set you back considerably. It's a bitter pill to swallow. You try to haggle, perhaps. 10 shillings, Master Bailiff. Surely that's a bit steep for a first offense. Perhaps 5 and a solemn promise to stick to regulation footwear henceforth. Sometimes rarely a particularly lenient or perhaps easily influenced official might be swayed, especially if you have a reputation as a generally law-abiding citizen. But more often than not, the fine is fixed, or the official is determined to make an example of you. Our current official looks like the latter type. No humor in his eyes, just the grim satisfaction of a job properly if joylessly done. He might then produce a small inkhorn and a piece of parchment, or perhaps a wax tablet, to record the infraction and the fine. Your name, your profession, the details of your sartorial crime. Wearing shoes of crimson cordwain leather with points of 1 1/2 inches, contrary to statute, and the penalty imposed. This record is important. It ensures you pay up, and it also marks you as a sumptuary law offender. If you're caught again, the penalties will likely be much harsher. You are now officially on the fashion radar. The actual confiscation could be rather humiliating. He might order you to remove the shoes right there in the street, much to the amusement of any onlookers who have gathered to witness your downfall. There's always a crowd for a bit of public discomfort. You'd have to unlace or unbuckle your prized possessions, your cheeks burning with embarrassment, and hand them over. Then you'd be faced with the prospect of walking home barefoot, or perhaps in your thin linen hose if you were wearing them, which offered little protection against the rough cobbles and whatever unmentionable filth littered the medieval street. It's adding insult to injury. One moment, you're stepping out in style, the next, you're padding home like a beggar, your fashionable dreams confiscated along with your footwear. It's a real walk of shame, medieval edition. A mainstream historical fact is that resistance or argument with an official enforcing sumptuary laws was a very bad idea. If you became abusive or tried to obstruct him in his duty, you could find yourself facing much more serious charges, like contempt of authority, or disturbing the peace, which could lead to a hefty spell in the stocks, or even imprisonment. So most people, however, aggrieved, would likely swallow their pride and comply, albeit grudgingly. Better to lose your shoes and some silver than your liberty. Now imagine the scene. You've handed over your beautiful crimson shoes. The wardrobe watcher, with a curt nod, tucks them under his arm, perhaps making a mental note that they look rather well made. A pity they were illegal. He gives you a stern warning about future compliance. See that this doesn't happen again, Master Cooper. The city has enough expenses without having to constantly remind its citizens of their obligations in matters of apparel. Next time, it will be 20 shillings and perhaps a day in the pillory for public edification. The pillory. The thought sends a shiver down your spine. Standing for hours, locked by your head and hands while the populace throws rotten vegetables or worse at you, was a deeply shaming and unpleasant experience. You watch him walk away, your confiscated shoes swinging slightly with his gait. You're left standing there, shoeless, poorer, and thoroughly deflated. The vibrant color of your day has leached away, replaced by a dull regulation gray. You begin the miserable trek home, acutely aware of every sharp stone and muddy patch beneath your unprotected feet. Your friends and neighbors, if they see you, will know instantly what has happened. Some might offer sympathy, others a knowing smirk. Old Thomas got caught by the wardrobe watchers again, they might whisper. Always was one for fancy footwear, that Thomas. Your reputation as a sensible, law-abiding craftsman has taken a hit. Historians still argue about the level of public support for sumptuary laws. While the elite who made the laws clearly believed in them, or at least in their utility for maintaining their own status, it's less clear what the common populace thought. Did they resent these restrictions on their personal expression and expenditure? Or did some of them internalize the idea that everyone should dress according to their station, perhaps even feeling a sense of satisfaction when someone uppity was taken down a peg? There was likely a spectrum of opinions. Some undoubtedly chafed under the rules, while others might have seen them as a necessary part of a well-ordered society, or even a way to prevent people from foolishly spending beyond their means. A quirky tidbit. There are accounts of officials who took their sumptuary duties to almost comical extremes. One such story, perhaps embellished over time, but illustrative of the mindset, tells of a German official who fined a woman because the silk ribbons on her hat were fluttering too seductively in the breeze, deeming it an unnecessary and provocative display, even if the ribbons themselves were technically legal for her to wear. It suggests a level of micromanagement and subjective interpretation that must have been infuriating. It's like getting a ticket because your car is too shiny, so you've been caught fined and deschooed. Your brief flirtation with high fashion has ended in ignominy and expense. As you trudge home, you might console yourself with the thought that at least you weren't clapped in irons or paraded through the town in a barrel, another charming medieval punishment for minor offenses. But the loss of your shoes and the dent in your pride and your purse is a stark reminder in the medieval world. Even your feet weren't truly your own. They, like everything else, were subject to the whims of fashion, the dictates of the law, and the ever-watchful eyes of the wardrobe watchers. Right, so you've been publicly deschooed, fined a small fortune, and are now trudging home in your socks, feeling rather foolish and significantly poorer. The crimson dream has turned into a muddy reality. But humans, my friend, are resourceful creatures, especially when it comes to something as personal and expressive as what they wear. Did everyone just meekly comply with these often draconian sumptuary laws? Did they all happily shuffle about in their regulation, browns and grays, their spirits, as subdued as their attire? Of course not. Where there are rules, there are always those who will try to bend them, break them, or find clever little loopholes to wiggle through. Stylish subversion was alive and well in the Middle Ages. One of the most common ways to get around the rules was through the art of hidden luxury. The laws often focused on the visible outer garments. So while your public-facing tunic might be made of perfectly legal, modest wool, what about the lining? Perhaps you could afford a sumptuous silk lining hidden from the prying eyes of the wardrobe watchers, but providing a secret thrill of opulence against your skin. Or maybe your undergarments, your shift or shirt, were made of the finest, softest linen, a luxury only you and perhaps your laundress would know about. It was a way of enjoying the feel of expensive materials without overtly flaunting them. It's like wearing incredibly fancy socks with your boring work suit, a little secret rebellion. Similarly, people got creative with trimmings and accessories. The law might forbid a full silk gown, but what about silk ribbons, or a silk purse, or silk embroidery on an otherwise plain garment if the amount of silk used was below a certain threshold? Enterprising individuals and retailers would pore over the wording of the edicts looking for ambiguities. If the law specified no ermine trim for commoners, did that include a single ermine tail used as a tassel on a hat? If the law banned gold cloth, what about gold-plated buttons or a belt buckle that was merely gilded rather than solid gold? The devil, as they say, was in the details, and people became very adept at finding those details and exploiting them. It was a constant cat-and-mouse game between the lawmakers and the fashion-conscious populace. Another tactic was to play with definitions. What exactly constituted scarlet? If your robe was a slightly less vibrant shade of red, could you argue it wasn't true scarlet and therefore permissible? If the law restricted the length of shoe points for gentlemen, yikasiras, did that apply to prosperous merchants who didn't technically hold that title, but certainly had the wealth lawyers or their medieval equivalents could have had a field day with the linguistic gymnastics involved in trying to argue that a particular garment just technically fell outside the scope of a poorly drafted sumptuary law. Your Honor, my client's shoes are not, in fact, pointy in the legal sense, but rather aerodynamically tapered for enhanced pedestrian efficiency. Well, good luck with that one. Sometimes foreign fashions offered a loophole. If a particular style or material wasn't explicitly mentioned in the local sumptuary laws, perhaps because it was a new import or trend, people might adopt it quickly before the authorities caught on and amended the regulations. This led to a kind of fashion arms race, with new styles appearing, becoming popular, and then eventually being legislated against only for a new, unregulated trend to emerge. It's a bit like how new social media platforms pop up. Cool and edgy until your parents join, or in this case, until the king issues a proclamation against them. A mainstream historical fact is that the very people tasked with upholding the laws, the nobility and the wealthy merchant class, were often the biggest trendsetters and sometimes rule benders. While they wanted to keep the lower orders in their sartorial place, they themselves were often engaged in fierce fashion competition with their peers, constantly pushing the boundaries of extravagance. This could create a trickle-down effect. If a duchess started wearing a new daring style, even if it was technically against some older sumptuary edict, it might become fashionable, and lesser nobles or wealthy townsfolk would try to emulate it, hoping the duchess's prestige would offer them some protection. This, of course, often led to new, even stricter laws being enacted to try and rein things in again. Then there was the "it's for a special occasion" defense. Some sumptuary laws had exemptions for specific events like weddings, religious festivals, or civic ceremonies where a certain level of display was permitted or even encouraged. People might try to stretch these exemptions, arguing that their overly fine attire was simply part of a legitimate celebration. "Oh, this cloth of gold doublet. It's just for my cousin's pig's christening, a very solemn and important event in our village, you understand." The official might not buy it, but it was worth a try. A quirky tidbit for you some people engaged in a form of sartorial camouflage. For instance, they might own an illegal garment but only wear it in private within the confines of their own home, or when visiting trusted friends where they were unlikely to be reported. Or they might have a reversible cloak, drab wool on the outside for everyday wear, but with a surprisingly flashy silk lining that could be turned outwards for a discreet moment of peacocking in safe company. It's the medieval equivalent of having a secret party outfit. Moreover, the sheer complexity and regional variation of the laws could sometimes be exploited. If you were a traveling merchant, you might claim that your attire was perfectly legal in your home city, even if it violated the local rules of the town you were currently visiting. This could lead to lengthy arguments and confusion, especially if the official wasn't entirely sure of the regulations in other jurisdictions. It wasn't a foolproof defense, but it could sometimes buy you time or a reduced fine. Historians still argue about the extent to which sumptuary laws actually changed people's behavior versus simply driving certain fashion choices underground or into more subtle forms of expression. Did the laws genuinely curb extravagance, or did they just make people more cunning in how they displayed their wealth and status? The constant need to reissue and strengthen these laws suggests that they were, at best, only partially effective. The human desire for self-expression and the allure of beautiful things are powerful forces not easily legislated out of existence. People will always find a way. If you can't wear a scarlet cloak, maybe you'll invest in an exquisitely carved ivory comb or a horse with an unusually ornate saddle. The display of status simply shifts to a less regulated area. And let's not forget the role of simple bribery or having connections. If you knew the wardrobe watcher, or if he owed you a favor, or if a few coins discreetly pressed into his palm could persuade him to look the other way, then the laws suddenly became much more flexible. This, of course, only added to the sense of unfairness for those who couldn't afford such influence. So while you might be feeling dejected after your run-in with the fashion police, take heart in the knowledge that you're part of a long and noble tradition of people who, throughout history, have refused to let their sartorial spirit be entirely crushed by overly zealous regulations. From hidden silk linings to strategically deployed ribbons, the medieval fashionista found ways to whisper rebellion even when they couldn't shout it from the rooftops in illegal crimson. Your confiscated shoes are a casualty, yes, but the war for wardrobe freedom was fought on many subtle fronts. So you're walking home, your feet decidedly less comfortable than they were an hour ago, and your coin purse significantly lighter. You might be wondering if this whole elaborate system of clothing control was really just about keeping Sir Reginald from mistaking Mila Giles for a fellow nobleman at the local joust. While social hierarchy was undoubtedly a massive driver, as we've discussed, There was often another very pragmatic and rather less glamorous reason behind many of these sumptuary laws. Good old-fashioned economics, specifically the protection and promotion of local textile industries. The Crimson Shoe catastrophe wasn't just a blow against social order. It might have been seen in some convoluted way as a tiny act of economic treason. Think about it. Medieval Europe wasn't a single unified economic zone. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and principalities, all vying for resources trade, advantages, and economic self-sufficiency. Textiles were a huge part of this economic landscape. The production of wool, linen, and later silk, and the weaving, dyeing, and finishing of these materials into cloth employed vast numbers of people and generated significant wealth. Regions like Flanders became famous for their high-quality woolen cloth, Italy for its luxurious silks and velvets, and England for its raw wool exports. These were major industries, the medieval equivalent of today's tech or automotive sectors. And just like today, governments or their medieval counterparts were keen to protect these vital, homegrown industries. One way to do this was through sumptuary laws that restricted the consumption of imported fabrics. If your local economy was heavily reliant on wool production, it made sense to pass laws that discouraged people from buying expensive imported silks from Italy or fine linens from Flanders, especially if you were trying to get your own nascent silk or linen industry off the ground. By legally limiting who could wear these foreign luxuries, or by banning them altogether for certain classes, the authorities could nudge or shove consumers towards locally produced alternatives. Why buy that fancy Milanese velvet? The subtext of the law might say, when good, honest, locally woven English broadcloth is perfectly adequate for your station and keeps our weavers in business. It was protectionism dressed up as social policy. A mainstream historical fact is that many English sumptuary laws, for example, specifically targeted imported goods. There were restrictions on wearing silks, velvets, and other luxury fabrics not made within the realm. This was a clear attempt to bolster England's own textile industries, which were growing but still faced stiff competition from established continental centers. Similarly, Italian city-states, while major producers of luxury textiles themselves, might pass laws restricting the import of certain types of cloth from other Italian cities or from further afield, all in an effort to protect their own specific niche in the market. It was a complex web of local economic rivalries. These laws didn't just aim to reduce imports, they also sought to stimulate domestic production and consumption. If commoners were forbidden from wearing silk, they would by necessity buy more wool or linen. This increased demand would in theory lead to more employment for local spinners, weavers, dyers, and tailors. It was a way of trying to keep money circulating within the local economy rather than seeing it flow outwards to pay for foreign fripperies. Some laws even went so far as to mandate the wearing of locally produced cloth, especially for specific occasions or by certain groups. For example, laws might require that the dead be buried in shrouds made of local wool, a measure famously enacted in England with the burial in woolen acts of the later 17th century, though the principle existed earlier, which was explicitly designed to support the wool trade. Even in death, the government seemed to say, you will support the national economy. Furthermore, by restricting access to luxury materials, sumptuary laws could help to maintain a price differential that benefited local producers of more basic goods. If everyone could wear silk, the demand for wool might fall, depressing wool prices and harming wool producers. By keeping silk an exclusive and expensive commodity, the laws helped to ensure a stable market for more everyday fabrics. It was a form of market management, albeit a rather blunt one. Historians still argue about how effective these laws were as tools of economic policy. Did they genuinely boost local industries, or were they too easily circumvented by smuggling black markets and the ever-present human desire for fashionable imports? It's difficult to quantify their exact impact. Smuggling was certainly rampant. If you couldn't legally buy that French lace or Flemish silk, there was always someone willing to procure it for you under the counter for a price. And the wealthy and powerful, who were often the ones making the laws, were also the ones most likely to grant themselves exemptions or simply ignore the rules when it suited them. However, the persistence of such laws suggests that rulers believed they had at least some economic utility, even if it was just to send a signal about supporting local enterprise. A quirky tidbit: sometimes the economic protectionism got incredibly specific, right down to the type of thread used for embroidery or the origin of buttons. For example, a law might forbid the use of gold thread imported from Cyprus if a local guild was trying to establish its own gold thread production. Or it might restrict the import of horn buttons from a neighboring territory if local button makers specialized in bone buttons. The level of detail reflects the intense lobbying that must have gone on from various craft guilds, each seeking to protect its own little economic fiefdom. It's like a medieval trade war, fought not with tariffs and quotas, but with proclamations about who can wear what kind of feather in their hat. So when that wardrobe watcher confiscated your crimson shoes, he wasn't just thinking about your immortal soul or the proper station of a cooper. He might also have been, perhaps unconsciously, enforcing a policy designed to protect the local guild of, say, brown leather tanners and makers of sensible, round-toed shoes. Your desire for fancy, foreign-looking footwear in his eyes could be seen as a small betrayal of the local economy. Perhaps the leather for your shoes was imported, or the dye came from a far-off land, or the style was a blatant imitation of some foreign fashion that threatened to undermine the market for good, solid, locally made clod hoppers. It adds another layer of meaning to your personal tragedy. You weren't just a fashion victim, you were a tiny, unintentional cog in the great machine of medieval economic nationalism. Your feet were in a small way a battleground for local industry. And today local industry won, while the general principles of sumptuary law, maintaining social hierarchy, controlling expenditure, maybe boosting local crafts, were widespread across medieval Europe. The specific rules and the zeal of enforcement could vary dramatically from one kingdom to another, and even from city to city within the same realm. So, let's take a brief imaginary tour of continental couture cops and see how your crimson shoe offense might have played out elsewhere. It's a bit like comparing traffic fines in different countries, only with more velvet and less horsepower. If you'd been caught in your offending footwear in, say, one of the prosperous city-states of Italy like Florence or Venice, you might have found yourself up against some of the most detailed and rigorously enforced sumptuary laws in Europe. These cities, with their wealthy merchant classes, booming textile industries, and strong civic pride, were hotbeds of sumptuary legislation. Florentine laws, for example, were notoriously specific, going into minute detail about the value of fabrics, the number of pearls on a dress, the length of a train, and even the types of food that could be served at banquets, all meticulously calibrated according to social rank and wealth. They had officials sometimes called ufficiali sopra, gli ornamenti delle donne, officials on the ornaments of women, because of course women's fashion was a particular obsession whose job it was to inspect trousseaux, police weddings, and generally ensure that the citizenry wasn't getting too flashy. In Venice, famous for its luxury and its courtesans, the laws tried, often unsuccessfully, to distinguish between the attire of respectable noblewomen and that of the city's glamorous but socially ambiguous sex workers. Your crimson shoes in Florence might have resulted in a swift fine and confiscation, possibly accompanied by a stern lecture on civic virtue and the dangers of lusso, luxury. Hop across the Alps to France, and you'd find a monarchy deeply concerned with maintaining the visual splendor and distinctiveness of its nobility. French sumptuary laws, often issued directly by the king, were particularly focused on reserving certain fabrics like cloth of gold, high-quality silks, and expensive furs like ermine for the royal family and the highest ranks of the aristocracy. There was a constant effort to prevent the burgeoning bourgeoisie from encroaching on these noble prerogatives. The penalties could be severe, including hefty fines and confiscation. If your crimson shoes were deemed too luxurious or too indicative of a status you didn't possess by French standards, you'd likely face a similar fate to your English one, though perhaps with a certain Gallic flair in the pronouncement of your sentence. Maybe they'd compliment your audacity before fining you into next week. Head east into the myriad states of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire famously quipped, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but certainly had a lot of rules, and the situation became even more complex. Sumptuary laws here were issued by emperors, princes, bishops, and individual free cities, leading to a bewildering mosaic of regulations. German cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg were known for their incredibly detailed Kleiderordnungen, dress regulations, which could specify everything down to the number of slashes on a sleeve or the type of embroidery permitted for different social groups. Enforcement could be quite strict, and as we've noted, public shaming was a popular punishment. Your crimson shoes might have earned you a fine, confiscation, and possibly an uncomfortable afternoon in the Schandkorb shame basket, or forced to wear a sign detailing your transgression. They took their order very seriously. Travel south to the Iberian Peninsula to the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, or Portugal. Here, sumptuary laws were also common, often reflecting concerns about the outflow of wealth to pay for imported luxuries, as well as the desire to maintain social distinctions. There was also, at times, a particular focus on differentiating between Christians, Jews, and Muslims through prescribed attire. Although this was more about religious and ethnic marking than purely sumptuary concerns. Spanish laws could be quite severe, and the influence of the church in promoting modesty and condemning extravagance was strong. Your flashy footwear might have been seen not just as a social offense, but as a moral one, potentially attracting the attention of ecclesiastical authorities as well as secular ones. A mainstream historical fact is that sumptuary laws often reflected the specific economic strengths or anxieties of a region. For instance, in areas with a strong silk industry, like parts of Italy, the laws might be more lenient about silk for certain classes, but very strict about imported wools that competed with local production. Conversely, in wool-producing regions like England or Flanders, the emphasis would be on promoting wool and restricting imported silks. It was all about protecting the home team. Even within a single kingdom like England, the rules could differ slightly or be enforced with varying degrees of enthusiasm from one town to another or between urban and rural areas. London, as a major commercial hub with a large and diverse population, probably saw more varied and daring fashion attempts, and thus perhaps more active enforcement than a small, remote village where everyone knew everyone else, and deviations from the norm were less common and more easily policed by social pressure alone. Historians still argue whether the sumptuary laws in different regions were primarily driven by independent local concerns, or if there was a significant degree of legislative borrowing, with rulers and city councils looking at what their neighbors were doing and adopting similar measures. There's evidence for both. Certain fashion trends, like the Krakowers, spread across Europe, and so did the legal reactions against them. However, the specific details of the laws, the precise fabrics restricted, the exact fines levied, often reflected local conditions, customs, and power structures. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all legal framework, a quirky tidbit. In Scandinavia, sumptuary laws also existed, though perhaps not as extensively documented or as famously enforced as in Italy or France. Viking and later medieval Scandinavian societies had their own ways of signaling status through dress, often involving elaborate metalwork jewelry and specific types of furs. As these societies became more integrated into the broader European mainstream, they too adopted forms of sumptuary legislation, often influenced by German or English models, to regulate emerging class distinctions and control the consumption of imported goods. So even if you fled to the fjords, your flamboyant footwear might not have been entirely safe from legal scrutiny. So your unfortunate encounter with the wardrobe watcher and his little rulebook was not a uniquely English experience. Variations on this theme were playing out all across the continent. Whether you were in Paris, Rome, Nuremberg, or Seville, daring to dress above your station, especially in something as noticeable as brightly colored or excessively pointy shoes, was a risky business. The names of the officials might change, the exact wording of the laws might differ, and the specific penalties might vary, but the underlying principle remained the same. Your clothes were public business, and the couture cops were always watching. Your crimson shoes, it turns out, were an international incident waiting to happen. You're now back in your humble dwelling, nursing your bruised pride and your even more bruised finances. Your beautiful crimson shoes are a distant memory, likely already catalogued in some dusty municipal storeroom, awaiting their fate. As you sip your probably rather watery ale and contemplate a future of sensible, law-abiding brown footwear, you might wonder, did these incredibly detailed, often oppressive sumptuary laws last forever? Were people condemned to an eternity of sartorial scrutiny? The answer, thankfully, for the fashion-conscious and for the sanity of future historians trying to unravel it all, is no. Like all things, the era of the hyper-vigilant fashion, police eventually began to fade, though it was a slow, uneven unraveling rather than a sudden collapse. Several factors contributed to the gradual decline of sumptuary laws from the late Renaissance onwards, though they lingered in some places well into the 18th century. One of the most significant was the changing economic landscape, the rise of capitalism, the expansion of global trade during the age of exploration, and the growth of a powerful merchant and professional class meant that wealth was becoming more fluid and less exclusively tied to land ownership and hereditary titles. More people had more disposable income, and they wanted to spend it on the good things in life, including fashionable clothing. The sheer number of people who could now afford and desired luxury goods made the old system of restriction increasingly difficult to enforce. It was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. The market forces were, in many ways, becoming stronger than the legal ones. Alongside these, social structures themselves were becoming more complex and less rigidly defined. While class distinction certainly didn't disappear, and having to this day the lines began to blur. The newly wealthy bourgeoisie, through their economic power, and sometimes by purchasing titles or marrying into aristocratic families, started to gain more social and political influence. They increasingly resented being told what they could and couldn't wear, especially when they could often outspend the impoverished gentry. The old justifications for sumptuary laws, that clothing must rigidly reflect a divinely ordained static social order, began to lose their persuasive power in a world where social mobility, however limited, was becoming more of a reality. The rise of individualism, a key feature of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, also played a part. There was a growing emphasis on personal liberty, individual expression, and the pursuit of happiness, which for some undoubtedly included wearing a really nice hat. The idea that the state had the right to dictate such personal choices as clothing started to seem increasingly anachronistic and tyrannical to forward-thinking minds. Philosophers and political thinkers began to argue for greater economic freedom and less government interference in private life. While these ideas took a long time to become mainstream, they gradually chipped away at the ideological foundation of sumptuary legislation. A mainstream historical fact is that the sheer impracticality and cost of enforcing these increasingly complex laws also contributed to their decline. As fashion trends changed with ever greater rapidity, lawmakers struggled to keep up. No sooner would they pass a law restricting a particular type of sleeve or headdress than a new, even more outrageous style would appear. The bureaucracy involved in drafting, proclaiming, and enforcing these myriad regulations was considerable, and the returns in terms of fines or genuine social control were often diminishing. Officials like our friend, the wardrobe watcher, probably got tired of chasing every newfangled fashion infraction. There were, after all, wars to be fought, taxes to be collected on things other than illegal feathers, and actual crimes to be solved. Policing hemlines probably started to seem like a rather low priority. Furthermore, as national economies grew and diversified, the old protectionist arguments for sumptuary laws became less compelling in some quarters. While some industries still lobbied for protection, others benefited from freer trade and the ability to import and export goods, including textiles. The rise of a global market for fashion meant that styles and materials from distant lands became increasingly desirable and accessible, at least to those who could afford them. Trying to legislate against these powerful market trends was a losing battle. Historians still argue about the precise moment or primary cause for the death of sumptuary laws, as it was a gradual process that varied across different regions. In England, for example, most sumptuary legislation was repealed in the early 17th century under James VI, who reportedly found them unenforceable and an unnecessary burden on his subjects and perhaps on his treasury if enforcement costs outweighed fine revenues. In France, they persisted longer with various edicts being issued throughout the 17th and even into the 18th century, though their enforcement became increasingly sporadic. In some Italian and German states, vestiges of sumptuary regulation lingered for a surprisingly long time, often more as quaint local customs than seriously enforced laws. The French Revolution, with its radical emphasis on liberty, equality, fraternity, and its attack on aristocratic privilege, dealt a decisive blow to the idea of legally mandated dress codes based on class, at least in France and its sphere of influence. A quirky tidbit. Even as the old-style sumptuary laws were fading, new forms of dress regulation sometimes emerged, often focused on different concerns. For example, during periods of war or economic hardship, governments might issue decrees encouraging austerity in dress, urging citizens to avoid extravagance not because of their social station, but as a patriotic duty to conserve resources. This is a different kind of sumptuary control based on national need rather than social hierarchy. We saw echoes of this during the world wars in the 20th century with utility clothing and campaigns to make do and mend. So the iron grip of the wardrobe watcher and his ilk slowly loosened. Fashion became, at least in theory, more a matter of personal choice and affordability rather than legal decree. The idea that you could be fined or publicly shamed for wearing the wrong color shoes eventually became a historical curiosity, something to be read about in dusty old books rather than experienced on the streets. Your descendants, a few generations down the line, might be able to wear crimson shoes or even purple ones with pointy toes without fear of legal reprisal, though they might still face the equally fearsome judgment of their peers, the fashion police of public opinion, which is a different beast altogether. The unraveling of these laws marked a significant shift in the relationship between the individual society and the state. It was a small step, perhaps, on the long road towards greater personal freedom and a world where what you wear is more about who you are or who you want to be than about what society dictates you must be. Though, as we'll see, the echoes of sumptuary thinking haven't entirely vanished from our world. So you can finally breathe a sigh of relief. The era of state-sanctioned shoe-shaming and fabric felonies has for the most part receded into the history books. You can in theory wear your crimson shoes with impunity, perhaps even add a daring purple hat if you're feeling particularly bold, and no frowning official will tap you on the shoulder and demand to see your sartorial license, DT. But as you stroll through your modern life, perhaps browsing online for the latest sneaker drop or agonizing over what to wear to that important job interview, you might pause and wonder, have the underlying ideas behind those old sumptuary laws truly vanished, or do they still linger like faint, ghostly threads in the fabric of our contemporary society? While we no longer have laws explicitly dictating that only dukes can wear ermine or that merchants must stick to a certain grade of wool, it's fascinating to consider how many subtle and sometimes not so subtle dress codes and expectations still govern our lives. Think about it. Do you wear the same clothes to a formal wedding as you do to a backyard barbecue? Probably not. Do you show up for a high-powered corporate job interview in ripped jeans and a band t-shirt, unless perhaps you're interviewing at a particularly edgy tech startup? Unlikely. These aren't legally enforced rules, of course. No wardrobe watcher will fine you for wearing white after Labor Day, a classic, if now largely defunct American social rule. but the social consequences of getting it wrong can still be very real, ranging from mild disapproval or ridicule to, in a professional context, potentially missing out on an opportunity. We still use clothing to signal status, identity, and belonging, just as our medieval ancestors did. Designer labels, luxury brands, the latest it bag. These are in many ways the modern equivalents of cloth of gold or restricted furs. They are expensive, often exclusive, and clearly signal a certain level of wealth and fashion consciousness. While anyone with enough money can theoretically buy them, unlike the legally restricted items of the past, their very price point creates a form of de facto sumptuary control. Not everyone can afford a $5,000 handbag or $1,000 pair of sneakers, so these items remain status symbols, creating visual distinctions based on economic power rather than birthright. It's a kind of sumptuary law of the marketplace. Workplace dress codes are another obvious modern echo. Many professions still have explicit or implicit rules about appropriate attire. Lawyers, bankers, and politicians are generally expected to wear formal business suits, conveying an image of seriousness and authority. Doctors and nurses wear scrubs or white coats, signaling their medical role. Uniforms for police officers, firefighters, and military personnel are not just practical. They are powerful symbols of authority and identity, instantly recognizable and commanding a certain response. Even in more casual workplaces, there are often unwritten rules about what's considered professional or appropriate. Wearing something deemed too casual, too revealing, or too eccentric can still lead to negative judgments from colleagues or superiors. It's not a fine, but it can certainly impact your career trajectory. It's a bit like the old guild rules ensuring members presented a respectable front. School uniforms are perhaps the most direct modern parallel to some aspects of sumptuary law. The stated aims are often similar: to promote a sense of equality by reducing visible socioeconomic disparities, to encourage discipline and focus on learning, and to create a sense of community and shared identity. By mandating a specific, often plain style of dress, schools attempt to remove clothing as a source of competition and distraction, much like medieval moralists railed against vanity and extravagance. Of course, students are just as adept at stylish subversion as our medieval friends, finding ways to personalize their uniforms with subtle alterations, accessories, or the right brand of regulation shoes. A mainstream historical fact is that even after the repeal of most formal sumptuary laws, social commentators and etiquette guides continued to advise on appropriate dress for different classes and occasions well into the 19th and 20th centuries. These weren't laws, but they exerted powerful social pressure. Books on household management and social decorum would meticulously detail what a lady or gentleman should wear for morning calls, afternoon tea, dinner parties, balls, and visits to the country. Getting it wrong could lead to social ostracism or being deemed not quite our class dear. This was social policing, self-administered by the upper and middle classes. And what about the fashion police of popular culture? Tabloids, fashion magazines, and social media influencers often pass judgment on celebrity style, creating best dressed and worst dressed lists. While this is largely entertainment, it reflects a continued societal fascination with judging people based on their appearance and a sometimes mean-spirited desire to enforce certain aesthetic norms. Being publicly shamed for a fashion faux pas on the red carpet might not be the same as being put in the stocks for wearing illegal shoe points. but it can still be a pretty brutal experience for the individual involved. The tools of shaming have changed, but the impulse perhaps remains. Historians still argue whether modern, fast fashion and the widespread availability of cheap, trendy clothing have truly democratized fashion or simply created new forms of status anxiety. On the one hand, almost anyone can now afford to participate in current trends, blurring some of the old visual distinctions based on wealth. On the other hand, the constant cycle of new styles, the pressure to keep up, and the subtle distinctions between cheap knockoffs and authentic designer goods create new hierarchies and anxieties. Is your $20 designer-inspired handbag a clever subversion, or does it mark you out as someone who can't afford the real thing? The game of status signaling through dress continues, just with new rules and new players. A quirky tidbit: some exclusive clubs, high-end restaurants, or even certain gated communities still maintain strict dress codes for entry or residency. No jeans, no sneakers, jackets required for gentlemen. These are private rules, not public laws, but they function in a similar way to the old sumptuary codes, creating an environment of exclusivity and reinforcing a certain image or status associated with the place. Try getting into the royal enclosure at Ascot without adhering to their famously strict dress code. You'll be politely but firmly turned away, regardless of your wealth or social standing, if your hat isn't right or your skirt is too short. So while the wardrobe watcher, with his fine book and measuring stick, may be long gone, the human tendency to use clothing to define, differentiate, and judge ourselves and others is still very much with us. The laws may have faded, but the social and economic threads that once wove them into the fabric of medieval life are still visible, subtly shaping our choices and perceptions in ways we might not always recognize. Your freedom to wear those crimson shoes is a relatively recent victory, historically speaking. Wear them with pride, but perhaps spare a thought for the long, complex history of who gets to wear what and why. And so, your imaginary journey through the perilous world of medieval fashion regulations, sparked by a pair of potentially problematic crimson shoes, draws to a close. You've tiptoed through the minefield of sumptuary laws, dodged the stern gaze of wardrobe watchers, and perhaps even learned a few tricks for stylish subversion. Though I take no responsibility if you try to line your sensible work jacket with illicit leopard print. We've seen how something as seemingly trivial as the color of your footwear or the fabric of your cloak could be freighted with immense social, economic, and even moral significance. It's a potent reminder that the way societies choose to regulate appearance often reveals a great deal about their deepest anxieties, their power structures, and their core values. What lessons can we, in our comparatively more liberated sartorial times, take away from this dive into the world of medieval fashion, police? Firstly, it underscores the enduring human fascination with clothing as a marker of identity. From the earliest societies, what people wore has been a way to communicate who they are, where they belong, and what they aspire to. The medieval obsession with legally codifying this was an extreme manifestation, but the underlying impulse to use dress to navigate the social world is timeless. We still do it every day, even if we're not consciously thinking about it. Your choice of a power suit for a presentation or a deliberately understated outfit for a first date is part of this ongoing dialogue of dress. Secondly, the story of sumptuary laws highlights the constant tension between individual desire for self-expression and societal pressures for conformity. The medieval authorities wanted order, stability, and a clear visual hierarchy. Individuals, however, often wanted to look their best, to express their personality, or to signal their rising economic status, even if it meant bending or breaking the rules. This push and pull is a recurring theme throughout fashion history. The desire to stand out versus the need to fit in is a dance we all participate in to varying degrees. Your medieval counterpart, yearning for those crimson shoes, was simply an earlier iteration of this very human drama. Thirdly, the economic drivers behind sumptuary laws are a fascinating reminder that fashion has never existed in a vacuum. It has always been intertwined with trade, industry labor, and protectionism. The concern about imported luxuries draining local coffers, or the desire to promote domestic textile production resonates with modern debates about global trade, fast fashion, sustainable sourcing, and supporting local economies. The materials we choose, where they come from, and who makes them are not just aesthetic choices. They have real-world economic and ethical implications, just as they did 600 years ago. That simple linen shift wasn't just a garment. It was part of a complex agricultural and manufacturing chain. A mainstream historical fact that bears repeating is that sumptuary laws were for the most part a spectacular failure in the long run. Despite centuries of increasingly detailed and often draconian legislation, people continued to push the boundaries of fashion. The laws were constantly being revised, reissued, and strengthened, which is usually a good sign that they weren't working very well. The human spirit's desire for beauty, for novelty, for self-improvement, even if only sartorial, proved remarkably resistant to legal constraint. It's a rather cheering thought, in a way, that even under oppressive regimes, the urge to express oneself, even through something as simple as a brightly colored ribbon or endearingly pointed shoe, can be difficult to extinguish. And finally, perhaps the most important lesson from our journey is a renewed appreciation for the freedom of choice we generally enjoy today, regarding our appearance. While social pressures and economic realities still heavily influence our wardrobe decisions, the idea of being fined, publicly shamed, or having your clothes confiscated by a state official simply because they are deemed inappropriate for your station seems almost laughably archaic to most of us now. This freedom is a relatively recent historical development, hard won, and easily taken for granted. So, the next time you agonize over what to wear, perhaps spare a moment to be grateful that your biggest worry is whether your shoes match your belt, not whether they'll land you in court. Historians still argue about the net effect of sumptuary laws. Were they a genuine tool for social stability and economic management, or merely an exercise in aristocratic anxiety, and ultimately futile attempts to control the uncontrollable tides of fashion and commerce? Perhaps they were a bit of both. They certainly provide us with an incredibly rich, if sometimes frustratingly complex, window into the mindset and material culture of the past. Those old laws, written on parchment, long turned brittle speak volumes about what medieval people valued, what they feared, and how they tried to make sense of their rapidly changing world. A quirky tidbit to leave you with: some of the most detailed sumptuary regulations come from periods of significant social upheaval or economic change, like the aftermath of the Black Death, which dramatically altered labor markets and social structures, or during the rise of powerful new merchant classes. It seems that when society feels most unstable, the urge to control the visible symbols of that society, like clothing, becomes strongest. It's as if, by meticulously regulating the surface, they hope to control the turbulent currents beneath. So, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of streets filled with people in all their legally prescribed finery. The sober wools of the peasants, the finer cloths of the merchants, the silks and velvets of the nobility. You might even spot a wardrobe watcher, his eyes ever alert for an illicit feather or an overly ambitious shoe. But hopefully you'll also remember the resilience of the human spirit, the quiet acts of sartorial rebellion, and the eventual inevitable unraveling of those meticulously woven rules. The world of medieval fashion police, with its intricate rules and dire consequences for a misplaced color or an overextended shoe point, now fades into the soft shadows of your room. The anxieties of sumptuary laws, the watchful eyes of officials, the quiet desperation of wanting to wear something beautiful against the grain of societal expectation, all these can recede, replaced by the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Let the images of vibrant, forbidden dyes and rustling, restricted silk soften and blur. The clatter of a medieval street, the stern voice of a wardrobe watcher, the slight sting of injustice over a pair of confiscated crimson shoes, all these can become distant echoes, a story told, a page now turned. You're safe in your own time, in your own space, where the choices of your wardrobe are guided by your own taste and comfort, not by ancient edicts. There are no fines to fear for your pajamas, no regulations on the thread count of your sheets. There is only the quiet stillness of the night, the gentle embrace of your bed, and the peace that comes with letting go of the day's concerns, and indeed, the concerns of centuries past. Allow yourself to sink deeper into that peace, feeling the support beneath you, the softness around you. Let your thoughts drift like clouds, unburdened, and light carrying you towards a restful, untroubled sleep. The history is now just a whisper, a gentle story to guide you into your dreams.